Yes, Stone Garden is a special story because it's the first building I built in my hometown, like birth town Beirut. Also, the one other particularity of it, it's positioned next to, really on the edge of the city center. The city center of Beirut that was completely demolished after the war, and that was completely rebuilt with this private public company that refurbished the whole thing very nicely. But there was a lot of manifestations and critiques around rehabilitation and the question of erasing the memory of the city. Because there were lots of old souks and people had a lot of a very emotional relationship to the city center, and it was completely transformed and cleaned up. So the question of memory was very much present when I had to deal with this project. Now I am aware of it more, but when I was designing, I wasn't all the time conscious of all these questions. At the same time, it's a building that portrays really my relationship to Beirut, what I had lived actually. It's very personal in a certain way because this is what I had lived in Beirut, and it manifested itself physically. And it is also a place that, or an architecture that talks a lot about not what I lived, but what I lived had also echoes a lot of what many Lebanese and Beirutis lived in the past decades there. And the whole story of that building started with my encounter with a photographer who is a French-Lebanese photographer, and who took Beirut during the war, a lot of photos of Beirut during the war, and of the city center more specifically. And he did this trip with Gabriel Basilico, Roberto Burri, and Robert Frank, so best photographers who were famed actually after the series of black and white photography of this demolished city center. And we met, and he came to me. I want to build this. I have this land that I inherited with my family from my father, who was a known Lebanese architect, like a modernist architect in that matter. And I want to build a building, so I don't know, like housing, but not any housing, but also have a gallery for art and for image and for foundation. So it was a very peculiar story, and at the same time we had to find a developer. So I felt very much engaged in that project, not only as an architect, but also as a person trying to make it happen, to find a developer who could build this project, to make up a whole team and make it happen. And at the same time, how to build there, on that side, very close to the water, very close to the city center with all its memory, in a neighborhood that is still medium scale, but that has the potential in the future to grow very high. So I wanted a project that really expresses its context and talks about something invisible, which is the urban regulation in Beirut, which just makes cuts in the, in forms of building, but sometimes is invisible. So the whole thing started with this kind of a sculpture that is just rising and taking in its shape and in its form all these legal lines, and making these visible almost without having the designer shape it. But of course, after I had to work it plastically and think of how this can exist. But I wanted also this building to disappear at some point. I wanted it to be like its context. How can it really talk about these openings, this vernacular architecture that is very much in place where we don't build in glass. There are no glass skyscrapers in history in that country, where you have a hot climate of 30 degrees in summertime and winter is mild. So how can one build just a glass skyscraper? So if you look at all the old houses, they were all like solid buildings with smaller openings, always relating to the outside in a much more climatically intelligent way. So thinking about that, the building cannot just have glass facade. It's just like with these openings that start to moderate the relationship with the exterior climate. And at the same time, like funnily enough, with these openings, the building started to talk also about the Beirut, about all these bulleted facades that were just eaten up by the war. And then thinking about now the opening maybe can be a place of life, it can be a place where nature can grow, where instead of being an opening that portrays these negative moments of conflict, they become places of life where like a large opening becomes a place where a big garden can live and nature could be part of architecture. It's not a new thing to deal with sustainability. It's a must to think of your environment when you're building. It cannot just sit without thinking about what is it relating to, what nature, what history, what. So in a sense, just listening to these elements of a site made an architecture that became almost evident, and that is anchored to its place, its history, but also to an environment. And probably without also wanting to be made, it's not a building made out of earth, right? We're in a seismic area. Beirut has been buried 7 times, so it has to resist any earthquake, and that's why it also resisted the explosion in the port. So it is a building that is made out of concrete, but then the facade was made with handwork, taking use of a lot of artisans, skilled workers, by also thinking of vernacular techniques that are forgotten and how to make them again alive. So we worked on this envelope and then made a comb and then combed the whole envelope. So there is also an emotional relationship with the people in place and making also the workers and the artisans part of the act of making and building. I think this building, Stone Garden, is. I think it's. I don't know if it's a starting point or it's a question. I mean, it's a building that is able to ask a question, and I think in that sense, it's important that architecture is critique. It's beauty. It has an experience. It's material. You want people to touch it, hug it sometimes. So it's interesting in that way. But it asks a question about what kind of identity, what kind of type of construction we can do in this region, how to live in a tower, how to live in relationship with nature. Can we have nature part of our dwelling, actually? Do we need outer balconies, or can we have inside loggias in this kind of climate? How do we deal with the changes in our cities and of high rises, actually? What kind of new form of high rise can we give way to? I don't think it's about giving a dogmatic answer, because I don't know, I have the modesty to just say this is one possible answer, and I'm sure there are so many different answers. But what is important is to be able to ask these questions and attempt to find possible answers through architecture and through spaces, and try to open up a dialogue with the context, and to be the most sensitive possible to the history of a context, but also to its natural and climatic condition in a way. And maybe through that, maybe we can be more close to a resilient architecture, because like the building was close to that explosion, all the interior were completely exploded after the explosion happened naturally. But the envelope of it, nature was able to just sit still, and so the number, or like the impact of the explosion was more mild on such kind of architecture.